Welcome to Ministries, the podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Christen Clark. She's been working in children's ministry for over 16 years, which is what inspired her to start her podcast, the Collide Kids Podcast. It's a show for kids and families where fun and faith collide. Her goal for every episode is to help kids discover they are loved by God. Christen is also a worship leader, speaker, and recently graduated with her master's from Dallas Theological Seminary. In today's episode, Christen and I are going to talk about how she records high-quality audio for her podcast and why she doesn't use a Blue Yeti, the advantage to breaking her podcast up into seasons, and the value of involving her audience in the kids-only segment at the end of the show. So let's jump right in. Here's my conversation with Christen Clark. Well, Christen, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Absolutely. This is so fun. I love being interviewed. I don't normally get to do this.
Yeah. Well, I first came across your podcast, the Collide Kids Podcast, when I was doing some research for another guest that I had on my podcast, Anthony Russo, the creator of The Bible is Funny.
Yeah.
I remember seeing a reel that you did. You were talking about the little drummer boy around Christmas and how obnoxious that would be for a new mom. And it was hilarious. And I saw that it got a ton of views.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of fun. And then I also was, as I was scrolling back and preparing for our interview today, I saw that you've also had some friends of mine from Ramsey Solutions back when I worked there, Courtney Dykstra House and George Camel on your show. So I wanted to reach out and have you on the podcast to share your journey. So to start off, I'd love to hear what got you into podcasting back in 2020.
Well, there was this little thing that happened to all of us that we weren't expecting and didn't know it was going to wipe out everything we thought we knew and really brought us back home and into some other creative elements. And I'm a creative person. I have to be moving and making something or putting something together, which is a big part of my job that was sort of not eliminated, but had to change quite a bit. And so I feel like it was something that the Lord really laid on my heart to do, but I really thought, I don't want to do that. Like there's so many podcasts out there already. I don't want to be another voice in that. But I started to realize that there was a gap or there was a vacuum when it came to podcasts for families and kids. I think a lot of things that are out there for kids are focused towards the parents mostly, or they're focused towards like the really young kids. And so that middle age is where my kids were and are now. And so I wanted to create something that my family could enjoy together. And so that's kind of where it came from.
What was your job at that point that changed, that it caused you to consider this?
So I've worked in church ministry for a long time, over 17 years. I was full-time, mostly in kids ministry and family ministry. So that was kind of my niche. That's my jam. That's what I was good at. So creating a podcast around that idea just fit, it just worked. I really feel like the job I was doing at the time, I was like the program director and large group director for kids ministry. I was on stage. I was, directing other people on stage. I was putting programs together. I was writing curriculum. And one thing that really kind of stood out to me just in my spiritual journey and also in my ministry journey was seeing how kids especially respond to story. I think we all respond to story, but for some reason that connection that kids had with hearing an adult share about their faith or share something that God was teaching them, it resonated so much more than speaking at them about what spiritual things should be happening in their lives. And so it was kind of interesting, like whenever someone would share a testimony or someone would share something that happened to them that week, it was just kids were so alert to that. And so I feel like I picked that up from my job working in children's ministry. And so I pulled that into the podcast.
Yeah, that's great. So as you were developing this idea for the podcast, where did the name come from, the Collide Kids Podcast?
Well, years and years ago, I wrote a curriculum for a large group program that we were doing on Wednesday nights at one of the churches I worked at, and it was called Collide. And that was the point, that where life and faith collide. At a few other churches, I started another program, and we called it Collide because it was just a fun word to say. And it just rolled off the tongue. And I'm like, I don't know what else to name it. Like, it was one of those things like, I feel like it's my word. So when I see another podcast called Collide, I'm like, whoa, that's my word. And it's not. But I feel a connection to the word collide, I guess. So that's where that came from.
Nice. Well, as I was listening back to the trailer episode and a few other episodes, I noticed you've had a great audio quality from the beginning, which isn't always the case for podcasters. They usually evolve over time. So I'd love to hear, what equipment did you start with? What equipment do you use now? And why has that high quality been of value for you?
I am a musician and a worship leader and a singer. And so sound quality matters to me. The tone, the pitch, I hear those things. It's hard to listen to podcasts that have bad sound quality,
Yeah.
honestly, especially if the levels are off. I don't think it's about the equipment so much as like recognizing where the levels are. And so anyway, that was just always something that I really focused on when I listened. And so when I started this journey, the blessing of my life is that I am married to an audio guy, and he had a lot of equipment laying around. And then he's also invested in some extra equipment to make this a really great sounding. So I give all the credit to my husband because he really knew what it took to make it sound really good from the beginning. We've evolved, as you can see behind me. I don't know if they can see the video, but there's a Yeti microphone right back there. And that is the best place for a Yeti microphone is on the shelf. And I'm really sorry if someone from Yeti is listening right now, but it just had a real poppy, like it was hard. I over-pronunciate apparently because of my vocal training. We'll blame that. That wasn't a good mic for me. And so we kind of went through a few things. I really enjoyed the Shure SM7B. I've had that for a while. And then just having a really good interface and processors and things like that. So it's not just directly plugged into the laptop. I think audio quality really does help. It makes it sound more professional, which is going to connect more people. And so that was always a thing for me.
Yeah, the Blue Yeti is a good mic if it's in the right treatment and on the right voice.
Right.
It's interesting how many people decide to use that just because they've seen other people use it, which I guess probably also goes with the SM7B to some extent these days. If you don't have a very well-treated room, it just picks up all of the things.
Right. And I'm in the basement of my house, and I live in a kind of an older house. So if anybody walks above me, even my small little dog, you could hear it picked up in the microphone.
Yeah.
And so I'd have to be like, nobody get off the couch until I'm finished recording. And so we had to figure something else out so that other people could move and live and exist in the house while I was podcasting.
Yeah, the SM7B is much more forgiving in that regard.
Yes.
I have the same thing. I've got 3 girls, and so sometimes when I'm recording, they're in the next room, and hopefully the treatment's well enough in here that it's not coming through. But so as I was looking at your show, you break up your podcast into different seasons. And back in just last year in the summer, you took a couple months off. I'd love to hear what your decision has been around deciding to publish seasons and what that break looks like.
Yeah. So definitely when I first started, it was all me. And the editing process took a lot of hours. And then there's networking and there's setting things up and recording. There's all these different things that I was doing all on my own, and just needed a break and really leaned into this idea of Sabbath. You know, we think of Sabbath as, okay, on Sundays we take a nap after church. But for me, I think Sabbath resonates a little bit deeper in that, you know, when God called his people to take a Sabbath, he was telling them, I want you to put down your productivity and trust me, even just for a day, one day a week, or for a period of time. I want you to trust me with the productivity and let me do the rest. There was just a lot of things happening in the summer with my family. We go on vacation, and I just didn't want to have to do all these different things to get everything set up just to kind of go through the summer for what, you know? And I felt like the Lord said, it's going to be okay if you set this down for a minute. And my family appreciated that for sure. And it was just kind of nice so that when I came back, I was excited to get started again. I was excited to do all the things I needed to do. And I think it prevented a little bit of burnout, which I think is also in the Lord's plan when we take that time to rest. I always say that rest is a resource. It's a tool. It's not a reward. So our rest is something that we use so that we can further help and continue what we're doing and do the things that God's called us to do. And so, yeah, so sometimes it's just for the month of July. Sometimes it's a few weeks more because getting kids started in school and all of that takes a little bit of effort from mom and dad. And so sometimes I take off more than a month, but for the most part, it's really just that time to sit and rest and also spend more time with my family.
Yeah, so what have you found with doing that is the best way to set an expectation for your listener that, hey, we are taking a few weeks off or a couple months off, and we're going to be back, and you're going to want to come back. So how do you set up that expectation so that they know what's coming up?
I think it's just really communicating your purpose. Don't just drop off the face of the earth and, oh, we're back. Okay. Like, surprise, I'm not dead. So I think just really letting people know, like, this is what we're doing. This is why. And I've explained that. And I've explained it in ways that kids can understand too. Like, hey, we're taking a break and it's because we need to rest and spend time with family. And we're going to be back when school starts. And kids are used to that. I also think because of having especially a long list of episodes, I can refer back to some of my episodes. So I've done that a few times where I'm like, hey, if you're missing the podcast right now on social media, if you're missing the podcast right now, here's a great episode I think you would love to listen to while you're driving to the beach or whatever. So kind of giving them some breadcrumbs throughout that break time, but not something where I'm creating new content. So reusing content is a great way to kind of get through that time. But I think still really being intentional about how you communicate that is really key.
Yeah, for sure. That's the thing that I've been telling clients that I work with, that seasons are great ways to do podcasting, but the main thing is you have to set up that expectation for your listener. Otherwise, they're gonna be like, where'd you go?
Right.
It was supposed to publish this week, I thought.
Right.
But yeah, and then that idea is great to on other platforms on social media say, hey, this is a great episode. It's we recorded this last year, and I think it'd be great to listen to, and new episodes are coming out in just a few weeks.
Right.
So kind of along those same lines, you have over 160 episodes that you've published now. Describe how the podcast has helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry.
When I first started the podcast, I was working in a church, doing great work that I love to do. And a lot of things changed in the last 4 years that I've been doing this. So it's kind of cool to see how the podcast has pushed me into a place I didn't know I could go. And so I think it's really opened doors for me of opportunity, first of all, just to meet some incredible people. Like I got to interview Scott Hamilton, the ice skater.
I saw that, yeah.
And listen, I'm not a good PR person. I just started DMing and emailing anybody like, hey, I love your story. Would you be interested in sharing on my podcast for kids? And I was surprised at how many people said yes. There were some people that said no or just didn't respond at all, which is fine. I expected that. But I think because of this opportunity that I'm giving people to speak to kids, it really opened up just some great relationships. And now I have some incredible friendships that I have just from having them on my podcast. And then I tell them, I'm like, listen, I think we're best friends now. Like if we're on a podcast together, we're connected for life. And so I love reconnecting with some of those people and, meeting them at conferences and stuff. It's opened doors for me to speak at conferences and speak at churches and work with different people. And so I've really been able to kind of launch more of a ministry platform on my own outside of just the local church, just to be able to do more with that and encourage other leaders and encourage parents. So the podcast has really kind of opened some doors I didn't know it could open. And I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I've found that to be true. Just you are specifically when you have an interview podcast, you're forced to network. And then that grows, and grows. And yeah, so it's great to hear that you've had those opportunities as well. You mentioned that you started off editing the podcast, and I saw a post that you edited at least the first 100 episodes. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to hear, what was your editing experience like?
Well, I'm not the perfectionist type, but I'm a little too critical of myself. So a lot of the editing process was just taking out all the times I was like saying something weird or, like where I'm like, that sounded awkward, And so really like listening and pouring through it, it was just not a fast process. I liked doing it when I got into it, but I also knew it was a time commitment. And so when the podcast got to a place where it could kind of start paying for a few helpers to jump in, I was ecstatic to start working with my editor. His name is Jay Lee, Provision Podcasts, and he does a lot of different podcasts, and he does fantastic work. It was affordable, and it was just worth the time to give back, to put into other things, and it provided me more of an opportunity to do the things I really love, like the interviews and the networking and things like that. So I feel like it was a good decision, but I think if you start out with an editor, I think you need to edit at least a few of them to get the hang of it and realize like, this is what I sound like. Mm-hmm. This is how I need to adjust some things. You know what I mean? Like, and really make sure that connection is good with how the equipment and how you're performing.
Yeah. I own a production business, and so I've been doing it for about a decade now. But as I started my podcast, I did the same thing. I edited, the first 10 episodes, I think it was. Because I'm an editor by default, I was being super critical of
Right.
myself and taking out all kinds of stuff. It was very helpful when I was like, I should have one of my guys edit this instead because this is taking a lot of my time, as you're saying.
Yeah.
And then it helps me still hear, I'm still reviewing the episode, but you still get that perspective. But having that at the beginning, if nothing else, to just hear, okay, that's how I actually am coming across. And I can change it by editing, but also it'd be good to self-edit in the interview itself so that I'm not having to make all these changes, or when an editor's editing it, have all these changes that we need to go through. So
sometimes I'll say, sorry, Jay, we're going to do that again. So he's like the third audience member in the private interview that we're doing. So I was like, Jay's listening right now and he's going to fix that.
Yep. I have some clients that do the same thing. They call my name out and say, Tim, we're going to fix it. Sorry, we're going to start that over.
Yes.
All right, let's take a pause for a second. Let's figure out what we want to
again.
where we want to go next. Yeah, that's great. So I saw that you are part of a podcast network as well, the River Radio Podcast Network, which actually happens to be here in Columbus, Ohio, where I'm at.
Nice.
And so I'd love to hear how you became part of that network and what the value's been there.
Yeah. So they actually reached out to me a while back and just said, we want to create a podcast network that reaches the whole family, and we need some family content. We need some kids content. And so instead of starting our own thing, we just figured, let's find somebody that's already doing the work and let's pull them in. And so that's how I got connected with them, with Chad Bradley, and actually interviewed them for one of my shows. So that was really cool to talk to them about being a radio DJ and helping families learn what it takes to be in the radio business. So that was really cool. So yeah, so that's been great. It's just really opened up a lot of doors for new listeners to discover the podcast, and also just a great connection to have in Columbus, Ohio. So I think that was a really cool thing that, networking is a great thing. And I think God is the greatest networker. And so sometimes there's some things that will fall in our lap. We're like, wow, how did I get connected with this? So I just know that God's hand is on that.
Yeah. So what role do they play in how you publish the episode, or sponsors, or what's their involvement, and how do you work together?
It's not really that connected. They definitely promote the podcast on their radio station. And so that opens up for more listeners. And then it also provides them with a way to push people to their network and other episodes and other podcasts. So it's kind of just a shared effort where we're like working together to promote each other. Yeah. And then I love that I get to be able to be that family voice for the show and for their networks and things like that. So I love that I get that connection.
Yeah, so the Clyde Kids podcast is supported both by sponsors and then listener support. So for listeners that want to add a sponsor or ask for listeners to help support the podcast, what would you recommend is the best place to start?
Great question. I'm still figuring that out. And so, listen, I'm 4 years in and I'm still like, I don't really know this whole thing. Jay, my editor, is actually also doing some other work in that and helping me to reach out to sponsors. But I think the big thing is just paying attention to what your audience is. If you know who your audience is, you're going to know what kind of products or services or sponsors are going to connect with your audience. I have to be very wary of different products and things that I promote because this goes to families and this goes to faith-based families. So it really has to be a very specific type of thing that I would be comfortable with telling people that I support, so finding that, looking on social media, I've done a few chat GPT searches and, find me a list of sponsors, and they give me a list, and then just reaching out to them and knowing that you need to at least reach out to, you're going to get like a 2% return. So if you think of it that way, it may be a little bit more than that. I don't know the numbers, but it's not a great return. So you really don't want to reach out to 2 people and bank on hoping those 2 people get back to you. You need to reach out to 50 people and then hope that 2 people get back to you. Yeah, so that's kind of how that works. But I think it's good. And I think the listener support is probably most helpful, just to let people know, if you like the show, share it with someone. I have Buy Me a Coffee connection on my website. Yeah. So I use that for letting people, if they just feel like supporting or reaching out. I'm working now on creating some resources for families to just kind of help make those connections, and hopefully we'll see some more sponsors come through. But yeah, it's always a tough thing. And so if you cannot monetize right away, don't be discouraged. Not all of us can.
Yeah, it takes some time. I mean, podcasting is a long game of growth anyway. And then the way that ads are usually sold is by, per 1,000. It's an interesting environment in that if your show isn't big enough, then they might not want to have you as an advertiser because you're not reaching enough people, but then you could be part of a network and be grouped in with some other shows. And so it obviously takes time, and I don't have any sponsors for my podcast, and I don't think I will for a while unless something pops up.
I will say, though, I think the misconception is that you only have to have the thousands of downloads before you can do it. And if you have a really niche market, you really can find sponsors. You just have to be very strategic about it. So, reach out to your friends first, like find people that have small businesses and say, hey, this is a really niche podcast. There's probably only going to be 100 people that listen to it. But hey, that's 100 people that would definitely be able to connect with you on a personal level because they got a recommendation from me. And so there is a level that you don't have to get to the thousands before you get advertisers. But if you're trying to, promote with Crayola or, Walmart, yeah, you're going to have a little bit bigger following. And that's okay. You got to work with what you got. But I think it is good to start small and just start reaching people. Let them know what you have to offer and why your audience is special, even though they're small. And I think you might still connect with a few, even though you don't have the downloads.
Yeah, that's good perspective. So you end each episode with this kids only segment. And I'd love to hear, what's the value been for involving your audience in the show?
That's my favorite part of the show. Like, even if no one listens to that part, I'd still do it because it's so fun. And a lot of times it's people from my church or my nephew. I've had, lots of people, just friend connections that have been able to be a part of it. I just reached out recently to one of my friends from college because she posted a video of her son saying a Bible verse. And I'm like, can I please put this on my podcast? So, but I love that part of it. I love that kids get to do it. I had a little boy recently who I told him, I said, hey, did you get to hear yourself on the podcast last week? And he was like, am I famous now? I was like, probably. But it was just so fun that like kids love to hear their own voices. They love to do that. When I was in kids ministry, if any of the younger kids got to come up on stage and talk in a microphone, that blew their mind. So for them to hear their own voices, I think that's really fun for them. And kids share some really funny jokes and great Bible verses. So it's really fun just to include that in each episode.
Yeah, that is a lot of fun. I also saw recently that you rebranded your album artwork. And that's something that, after a few years, you might consider doing as you did. And so I'd love to hear, what were your decisions that made you want to change the album artwork? And then also, what's the significance of the green glasses?
Well, I'm wearing them now. So when I was in kids ministry, it was kind of like a stage prop for Vacation Bible School. And when I was leading worship, I would wear the big, giant green glasses that had no lenses. But then I turned 40 and I needed ones that had real lenses. And so I had to buy some. So I did find some neon green because it's just my favorite color. But I think the idea for changing it was time. It just needed a refresh. I was tired of looking at it. Because I created it on Canva a long time ago.
Gotcha, yeah.
And so I wanted to rebrand a little bit. I've had like my social media audited a few times, like, from coaches and consultants just say like, hey, what would you change? What are some things? And they all said, we're missing you. Like, we're not seeing you enough. We can see all your episodes, but we don't see you. And so that was one of the first things I changed, was making sure that my face was on it, which feels like I'm not obsessed with my face. Like, that's not the point. It's just that I think people do connect with someone when they can see who it is that they're going to be listening to. It's a credibility thing, even though that seems silly. So I had to use the green glasses that I was wearing, but wanted to include something that just had my face on it so that people felt a connection. And if you look at the trends in popular podcasts, that's where a lot of them are going. It's somebody's face there. And so I just felt like it was time to refresh. So I did that. And I actually put it out. I went on Fiverr and I had someone like create me a logo, and then I created my own, and then I put the two on social media and I said, which do you prefer? I always poll my family. We have like a really long group chat with my parents and my siblings. And so I sent it to them first and they all kind of voted on one, and then I put on social media and they all voted on one. And almost unanimously, everyone picked the one that I created. And so I thought that was really interesting that like, I'm not a graphic designer, but it was just that colorful picture and, the picture of me. And it worked out. So thankfully I didn't have to pay too much money to get it done. But yeah, I just felt like it needed a refresh.
Yeah, that's one thing that I learned specifically that Dave Ramsey would say over, that people connect with people. And so that's why we put faces on books. That's why we put faces on podcasts. Now, I haven't done that on my podcast. I have a picture of a microphone because I didn't want to put my face on my podcast. But we'll see. That may change in the future. But for now,
really tiny, like in the corner. Like, here I am.
So Before we go to the high pass segment, one last question for you here. What are you most excited about for the future of the Collide Kids podcast?
I think just kind of the unknown. It's not something that I prepare for years in advance. It's really like month to month, figuring out what's coming next, what's coming in the next season, and just the new connections. I've only had a few repeat guests. I've had a lot of new people that I've connected with, and not all of them are, affluent or have a lot of notoriety or a big following or whatever. Sometimes it's just normal people that I've met that have incredible stories. And so I love that the podcast lends itself to that. And I hope to continue networking and meeting, some really great people with great stories.
Nice. Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump into the high pass segment where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things.
Okay.
So we got a little audio pun here and we'll just do a little rapid fire. I read in your bio that you love late night bowls of cereal. So what's your go-to favorite cereal?
Man, I do love cereal. It's like always the food that you eat when you don't know what else to eat. That's my food. You know what I mean? I'm a big fan of Cinnamon Toast Crunch. I love a good granola. I like granolas. The peanut butter crunch from Kashi, it's like a granola from them and it's high in protein. So you feel healthy. It's delicious, or just a really great bowl of Trix, all the kid ones, because I have kids at my house. So yeah, I love cereal, but I try not to eat it as a meal. It's a snack because it's not very nutritious, but sometimes it feels like it is.
Nice. Yeah. All right. What is your favorite part about having a podcast?
I think just being able to connect with people and make new friends. I love that part of it. And just being able to meet some really incredible people that I wouldn't get to meet. You can't just like message someone on the internet and say, hey, you want to talk for an hour? But if you have a podcast, you can. So I love that I get to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. That's one thing I also enjoy about my podcast is getting the opportunity to do the same, that talk to other ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting. It's a lot of fun. So what's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how the Collide Kids podcast has impacted their life?
Yeah. I think around Thanksgiving, I released an episode with my friend Esther Moreno, and she shared the story of how she and her family, they have these like popsicle sticks, and they write down the things that they're grateful for all throughout the year, and they put it in this jar. And then at Thanksgiving, they put the jar as a centerpiece on their table, and Thanksgiving, they open it up and they read all the things that they've been thankful for all year long. And I thought, that's such a cool idea. I love that idea. And then I had a listener reach out to me and sent me the picture of their jar and how their family has done that all year since they heard that episode. And they were reading through all the things they were grateful for and how it just brought them together and really made them thankful for God and all he's done for them. And so I just love that like people are listening and they're really applying the things that some of my friends are telling them about. And so I just love that that was a big impact on their life.
Yeah, that's a really cool story. A great idea to do that, to remember the things that you're thankful for. It can be so easy to keep that in the moment.
Yeah.
All right. What is one of your favorite ministry podcasts to listen to? Or what's your favorite ministry that you wish had a podcast?
This is a great question. I don't know. I listen to a lot of different kinds of podcasts. I think, honestly, this is kind of nerdy, but I just graduated from seminary. And so my favorite podcast is the Dallas Theological Seminary Chapel. I still feel a connection there, even though I'm finished. But yeah, so I guess that's my favorite ministry podcast. But I just love, connecting back with. And they also have a few podcasts, like interview style and conversation, but I really enjoy that. So kind of Bible nerdy, but that's what I am
that's
now.
Great.
So.
Yeah. All right. Well, as we come to the end here, I'd love to hear your advice. Now that you've been doing this for over 3 years with your podcast, what's your best advice for a ministry leader who's wanting to get started in podcasting this year?
Yeah, 2 things. First of all, you need to create a template because that is going to be your saving grace when you're going through what you're going to do for each episode, having that plan in place. And it could be very generic, like we're going to have an intro, we're going to have this, I'm always going to ask this question, this is how we're going to close it. Just having that structure is going to help you so much. The other thing I would say is write down a list of 10 episode ideas. You don't have to do them, but if you have a list of 10 ideas before you start, that's going to help you so much because the first episode, we're so excited and we're like, yes, I can do this. And the second episode, you're like, I think I could still do this. And then the third episode, you're like, I don't know if I can keep doing this. And that's truly where a lot of podcasts fall off. One of my friends was sharing with me that like most podcasts, I mean like 90% of the podcasts, I'm making that number up, but it's pretty high. They only have 10 episodes or less. So of all the podcasts on Apple Podcasts and all the platforms, they have 10 episodes or less because they got into there without a plan. And so if you can get 10 episodes in mind, then you have content for the next time. And then that's going to spark new ideas as you continue to go. But I would always say to like have a list of some ideas of what you want to do. And then from there, figure out what your template is and how you're going to structure each show. And that's going to help you really moving forward. You can change the template and you can adjust it as you move along. But I think that's going to help you to get started because that's kind of where we get lost, right? We're really good at starting and then we're like, now what do I do? So having that structure in place is going to help you, especially if you're doing interview style, because it gives you a guide to like know what to do next when you have a really awkward guest that doesn't talk very much, or you have something that like goes really sideways and you're like, where were we? Okay, now back to where we were because I know where we are in the structure. So as a person that's not very organized, having organizational things in my life has really helped me.
Yeah, and it also helps the listener too, right? To know this is what this show is about every time and know it's, oh yeah, we're going to have this interview. We're going to have this segment at the end. Yeah, that's great. Great advice. Well, Christen, thank you so much for taking the time today to chat with me about your podcasting journey with the Collide Kids podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun. I love getting to talk about podcasters and I love meeting new people. So thanks so much for letting me be on your show.
That was a fun conversation with Christen and hearing her podcasting journey that started back in 2020 to now having over 160 episodes. She had some great advice there at the end about creating a template for your podcast. I mean, having that structure like she was talking about will help you be consistent from episode to episode, which is great for you as the host, because then you know what you need to prepare, and then great for the audience so they know what they can expect. You can listen to the Collide Kids podcast with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries the Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, text it to a friend or share it on social media. Together, we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. And if you haven't already, follow or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on the next one, and leave a 5-star review while you're at it. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Logan Ketterling, host of Talking Church. Logan and I are going to talk about the role the podcast plays in the overall digital strategy of River Valley Network, how he prepares for interviews with well-known guests, like Dave Ramsey, for example, and what it's going to take to achieve some of his 2024 goals for the podcast. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.